Welcome to Biblical Foundations, a podcast of the Center for Biblical Studies at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. I'm your co-host, Jimmy Rowe, along with Dr. Andreas Kostenberger. Join us as we discuss issues in biblical scholarship for the church.
Let's now turn specifically to the new Encyclopedia. Why don't you tell us how this work came to be? I'm sure there's a fascinating history to that, and maybe describe the process that you and your co-editor went through to see this significant work through to publication.
No, thanks. That's it is a very significant work. I think it's simply because of its size and its contributors. This actually started out in 2012. I was approached by T&T Clark to do a companion to Second Temple Judaism, because I had just published a couple things with them on Second Temple Judaism, and I indicated to them that I was willing to do this, but Second Temple Judaism is not and never has been a primary field for me, so I needed somebody with more seniority than myself to be able to guide this. So I contacted Professor Lawrence Stuckenbrook in Munich, and we quickly began with the rubric of the companion series. You're familiar with the T&T Clark companion to the Septuagint and companion to the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it quickly expanded into the current encyclopedic form, and so really kind of got much larger than what could fit into the companion series. And so what we did is again, this is summarizing 7 years of Skype and travel and phone conversations and everything else. We looked at a number of other reference works and tried to see what are the most essential elements to cover Second Temple Judaism from every aspect. And then we came up with a master list of topics. And then from the list of topics, we spent many hours often trolling through academia.edu or through peer-reviewed journal articles and monographs, through Atla Religion Database and so forth, to find out who are the main scholars that are contributing to that subject area. Not somebody who is that has a particular slant on something, but somebody who is a recognized expert in maybe Fourth Ezra or in Mikvaot or something like that. And then we began issuing invitations, and we determined length of essays and that sort of thing. And then over the course of those years, we received all those essays, and we decided to incorporate a number of images with about 200 of those essays. At the end, there are 642 essays, and there are 407 contributors from around the world, really, from 26 different countries. And we utilized 200 images that were specially acquired and largely purchased for by T&T Clark to accompany and illustrate some aspect of the essay. And then I think it was maybe 3 summers ago, I traveled to Munich, and Professor Stuckenbrook and I worked on what I think is one of the most unique contributions of the encyclopedia, and that's a set of periodized maps. They're custom designed maps that cover select eras from the entire Second Temple period, from Alexander the Great all the way through Bar Kokhba. And so we designed those, and T&T Clark commissioned a professional cartographer to create those electronically. So that's sort of the process. And then just in October, I think it was, we finished the 7th set of proofs for 1,500 pages. And then it was just in print last month.
Yeah, it's interesting you'd mentioned the maps, because that was the first thing that caught my attention when I bought the encyclopedia at the recent SBL meetings. They're beautiful, and I think that'll be so useful. I also love the layout, the way the volumes are conceived. In part 1, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit as to the reasoning behind that. But to start out with as a framework with the history of Second Temple Judaism, and then in part 2, moving to the historical and political background of Second Temple Judaism, and then in part 3, you obviously different contributors are dealing with the literature one by one, and then, as you mentioned, part 4 has has a significant number of topical essays. I think it's a very intuitive, way of conceiving of that vast area of study that I think is a lot more helpful than if you simply had an A through Z presentation, from beginning to end.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that was we really wanted a resource that was going to be useful for people in every aspect of the field. So the first essay by Professor Stuckenbrook really problematizes, when we're talking about Second Temple Judaism, what are the terms we can use? How do we define it? And what are the problems with identifying it and studying it, and the different interdisciplinary discussions that happen with that?
Why don't you just give us and our listeners a little bit more on, some may not be even familiar, exactly what do we mean when we talk about, Second Temple Judaism? Maybe you can just give a brief exposition of that.
Sure. Yeah. So that's easier. Well, that's not so easy to define. Different people define Second Temple Judaism in different ways. Some people prefer the term early Judaism. What we've chosen to do is define Second Temple Judaism in terms of a time frame. So we're thinking from the time of the conquest of Alexander the Great. So 330s BC, all the way through the time of Bar Kokhba revolt. So that's 135 AD. So, and everything in between. And there are a number of phases in history, in the history of Second Temple Judaism. So from the outset, Alexander the Great lived a very short time, but conquered a wide swath of land. When he died and didn't have any successors, there's about 22 years of infighting among his successors called the Diadochi. And all of this is very much, Judaism is very much sort of in the background here. There isn't a large proliferation of literature during this time, but it's really in subsequent years, during the reigns of the dynasties of the successors of Alexander the Great, during the eras of the Seleucids and Ptolemies, that a large proliferation of literature from Jewish circles occurs. So when we talk about Second Temple Judaism, we're talking about the wide variety of Judaism that is practiced from the time of Alexander the Great in the middle of the 4th century BC, all the way up through the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 AD. And I say the wide swath of Judaism because we're talking about diaspora Judaism, so Judaism in Asia Minor, Judaism in Syria, Palestine, as well as Alexandrian Judaism, which in some respects is very different from the Judaism that we find, say, among the Dead Sea Scrolls and so forth.
So going back to the layout of the volumes, would you be able to give some examples of maybe notable entries and key contributors?
Well, let me sort of raise that with, or address that with some things that I learned along the way. There were a lot of subjects that I learned about that really I had never heard of before. And so coming into this was very eye-opening. A lot of the names of scholars, most of your listeners have probably never heard of because they're experts in fields that are not often covered by the likes of us as evangelical Southern Baptists. So there are a few that you'd recognize. Steve Mason, perhaps. Dale Allison did one on James. John Axel of John. But there are also essays. So, for example, you think of when, as I mentioned earlier, when Mary has to offer sacrifice for her purification in Luke chapter 2, you wonder, where does she get the doves from, or the pigeons? And so jokingly, you think, well, is she running around like in New York City where you see pigeons all over the place and just grab a couple of pigeons? Well, where does she get there? There's a whole industry of doves and pigeons in the ancient world, and there's a whole discipline of study around the subject of columbaria. And columbaria are essentially like you'd think of in a large mailroom at a university. The pigeonholes, they're just look like a large honeycomb almost, where they would raise pigeons precisely for the purpose of sacrifice. And we have a scholar who's contributed on that, who has done archaeology in some of these kinds of areas. We have, of course, David De Silva has written on the Old Testament Apocrypha. Let's see, some other names. Andre Lemaire has written on Paleo-Hebrew and Hebrew and Aramaic paleography. It's interesting to note, we know the parable of the Good Samaritans, and we understand, and this is sort of one of my burdens with the encyclopedia, we understand that when we hear the word Samaritan, we're supposed to think something negative, but we really don't know why. And inevitably, what scholars and students alike do is go to the best commentaries out there and just sort of digest whatever the commentaries have to say about that. Well, this encyclopedia, there's an article written by Magnar Cartwright, who's a leader in the study of the Samaritans, and she traces the history of Samaritans, and then with other things on Samaritanism and Samaritan Pentateuch and so forth. So it again illuminates some of the historical background that sets the context for us in the New Testament.
Yeah, we understand, of course, it's hard to pick out individual examples. In many ways, this is going to be a reference work that's going to serve scholars in particular and interested students of Scripture well for many decades. But thanks for giving us a few highlights. I think the encyclopedia was the subject of a review panel at the recent meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature in San Diego. What
It was.
Yeah, what kind of feedback have you been getting so far, and how do you see the work being used?
Well, those are really this kind of the same question. The way we're conceiving of it is how the feedback that we've received and how we look for it to be used. We asked when this was organized, we asked that the panelists not do a normal book review. We didn't want somebody to simply survey what we've done and comment on what's good or what's bad. What we really wanted them to do is, and what they did very well, was discuss what kind of conversations can be had from an encyclopedia like this. In other words, we have, for example, an essay on the history, the fall of Masada in history, but we also have essays on the archaeology of Masada. We have an essay on Josephus and historiography, and we have an essay on the Masada texts. So when the encyclopedia puts together, for example, things like texts and archaeology, what kind of conversations can be had from archaeologists and from exegetes? So the papers that were given there, which will probably be published in maybe a year and a half, we're still getting that together. We're going to put together a collection of essays, is really illustrating what we're hoping to happen. And that is, among specialists in Second Temple Judaism, that it can facilitate interdisciplinary dialogue, so that those who are thinking about ritual purity on a textual level have access to some recent work and some well-referenced work on mikvaot and those sorts of things. That's really what we're hoping for in terms of specialists in Second Temple Judaism. What I'm really hoping for, what my real burden is for students and for scholars, for authors who are working in Second Temple Judaism, or even maybe writing a commentary on the letter of James, that they have a reference work that can get them right into the primary source material in an informed way. There's a tendency, as you know, Professor Kustenberger, to simply, for pastors, for students, even for scholars, to simply repeat a list of references to primary source texts in Second Temple Judaism in a commentary or a paper or something without really knowing what those texts are about. And so I'm hoping that this really facilitates us all to be able to have a more robust tool to get into the primary sources and to understand them in their own contexts, first and foremost, so that we can be more responsible in using them. I think sometimes some of our evangelical colleagues have gained a bit of a reputation for knowing just enough about Second Temple Jewish sources to use them as background for the New Testament. And I think there's something to that. But at the same time, it opens up the accusation of we really don't know these texts. And so for me, in my own personal scholarly endeavors, my work in Second Temple Judaism is really intended to steep me in the language and literature of both the Old Testament and Second Temple Judaism, so that whenever I come to the New Testament, whenever I make references to background material for understanding a text from the Gospel of Matthew or something like that, I actually know what I'm doing with the sources and have some credibility, really as a good witness and also as a good steward, because I believe in the totality of God's providence, that he has preserved his word for us, of course, but he's also preserved for us material culture and also literary evidence of the context of the New Testament. So I want to use as many tools as I can to better understand the words on the page. And that's really what I hope to see our evangelical brothers and sisters doing as well.
Absolutely. We certainly appreciate your and Dr. Stokenbrook's assiduous work on this. It's just incredible the amount of even organizational work, and not to mention the actual scholarship that went into a volume such as this, and the publisher T&T Clark as well. To close us out with an anecdote, at a previous school, I taught a colloquium for first-year PhD students, and we had Richard Hayes just across the way from Duke University join us for that. I invited him, and before the session, gave him a tour around campus and tried to talk up the PhD program and how our students and so forth. And then he gave a lecture, and afterwards stayed on for some student presentations. And at some point, as he was talking and talked about Philo and then Josephus and so forth, one of his students in the PhD program interrupted him and said, "Excuse me, Dr. Hayes, who's Philo?" And ouch. Yeah. I as a PhD director at the time, I was quite embarrassed. And so that planted the immediate resolve that we needed to add a course on Second Temple Judaism to our curriculum, which we did. And even here at Midwestern, I'm in February going to teach a seminar on ancient Jewish literature, and so the Encyclopedia will serve as an excellent, really invaluable reference tool in both preparing my lectures and in guiding the discussion. So please keep up the good work, and every blessing as you serve him.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us today at Biblical Foundations. For more information, please visit the Center for Biblical Studies at Midwestern at cbs.mbts.edu. For further resources, please also visit biblicalfoundations.org. Please join us again next time at the Biblical Foundations podcast.